Hi there, my name's Dr. Marcus Bussey. I work at the University of the Sunshine Coast, where I teach some history and some futures and just work with people in between. Now, I was asked recently, can poetry save the world? And it's an interesting question. And I want to sort of take you on a little journey as my thinking sort of progressed with this. It was asked because I'd recently published this book here, and it's got poetry of all kinds in it, and I'm going to come to some of those poems later and give you a taste. But I wanted to answer the question in a more full and sort of encompassing way. Very recently, my wife's beautiful grandmother Olga passed away, and one of the things in her last years that would wake her up and get her sparking was a poem she'd learned as a young woman, as a girl, in fact, at school. It was by Rudyard Kipling. Maybe you would know it already. It's a famous poem called If. So she would be in her bed, in a doze or a dream. You could sit beside her, as her son Ken did a number of times, and start reciting it. If you keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you, if you can trust yourself when all men about doubt you, but make allowance for their doubting too, if you can wait and not be tired by waiting, or being lied about, don't deal in lies, or being hated, don't give way to hating, and yet don't look too good nor talk too wise, and so on it goes. This poem was so deep in the fabric of her being that, yes, it would touch her and lift her up. If only we could all have such experiences with poetry, because, of course, poetry is an elusive art, and it's also an art that many find somewhat distant from their realities. And yet, for me, it can touch very deeply into the fabrics of all our being if we but listened, if we but gave ourselves time. And these are qualities, I think, that in a very busy world we don't do often enough. So, jumping from Olga, I want to turn now, to my mother, Marjorie, who's a well-known West Australian painter. And she's been working on a painting at home. She lives in Melbourne. And it's inspired by a poem that takes her right back to her childhood. It's a poem by C.J. Dennis. Now, my mother grew up in Bunbury. So this poem is called Hist, and maybe you know it too. Hist, hark, the night is very dark, and we've to go a mile or so across the Possum Park. Step light, keeping to the right. If we delay and lose our way, we'll be out half the night. And so it goes on. And my mum, I visited her just a few weeks ago, will start reciting this poem. And it's very, very meaningful because it brings back a quality of her early years when she, as she tells the story, would walk home across the farmlands from her aunt's place to her own home as a girl of maybe 8, 9 years of age. So this poem too has something that anchors her in a time and place, and it's rich in visual meaning. And I think the visual quality of poetic words must be acknowledged, especially in relation to somebody like my mother, who's a painter. So then we can think in terms of our own times that poetry enables us, if we give it space and slow down, to touch elements of ourself that perhaps we overlook in the busyness of the day-to-day. Poetry acts as a circuit breaker. These two poems by Kipling and Dennis are both rich, strongly visual, and evoke a certain feeling, a certain sense of time, or a certain quality of being. Kipling particularly is talking about the qualities of what you might call right living, and not being caught up in the need to meet others' expectations, demands, and so on, but to be true to yourself. And poetry speaks from that place of true to yourself. It's not to say that there is one absolute truth, but that there is this truth that comes from living well. Now, then poetry can act as a lever for change, though. Now I'm thinking to those halcyon days, as I would call them, of the 1960s and 70s, when there were fantastic musicians writing great poetry, turning them to song. Bob Dylan recently was awarded a Nobel laureate for poetry, okay? And you might think, well, he was a singer, countercultural person and so on, but over his incredibly long career, he's produced some incredible pieces of music, but also incredible sets of lyrics to go with them. Come gather round people wherever you roam, and admit that the waters around you have grown. And accept it that soon you'll be drenched to the bone if your time to you is worth saving, and you better start swimming, or you'll sink like a stone, for the times they are a-changing. Incredible prescience there, because the times in our modern world have been changing constantly, not in terms of decades or centuries, but in terms of months or years. Those kinds of poems as lyrics to songs acted as a catalyst for change and for a shift in consciousness. And a shift in consciousness is what we need for a world to come awake to itself. A shift in consciousness is what triggers change. Change emerges and challenges. We have to reframe. I know I'm thinking COVID, but before that I could be thinking just a month before COVID of the bushfires that raged across Australia. And before that, and before that, and before that, you know, the story. We seem to be living in a time of cumulative crises. But these crises act, from a poet's perspective, as an invitation to reflect on the world, reflect on who we are in that world, how we might become more attuned to the world in a way that's going to enable us to cope with the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, another poet, but also to cope with what is demanded of us right now in every minute, which is to slow down and to be aware of our potential in life. Before I leave that 60s and 70s sort of period, I'd like to turn to Joni Mitchell, the beautiful song Big Yellow Taxi. Have you ever looked at the lyrics without the music? They paved paradise and put up a parking lot with a pink hotel, a boutique, and a swinging hotspot. Don't it always seem to you that you don't know what you've got till it's gone? They paved paradise and put up a parking lot. That could have been written yesterday. It could be written about all the wonderful natural beauties that we've lost, but also the cultural and heritage beauties that seem to be covered over again and again by the call of the new, you might say. Now, there's nothing wrong with the new, but the new that throws out the old, that is not in some way attuned to the past, to nature, to the world that underpins the sort of the micro bubbles that we all live in, then we tend to, as cultures and individuals, broad, collective as well as the individual, we tend to lose our footing. We tend to not necessarily engage in the world in a way that's going to make the world a better place. Poetry does that because poetry has a deep mythical level. There's a timelessness to poetry. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4 poems that I just read from. Each have a timelessness to it. But, you know, it takes a bit of time to open up to that openness of the lyrics themselves and to allow them to sink in. Here I'm thinking of a classic musician from the period that I've just been reading from, but whose final album came out 2018 in the year that he died. Perhaps you know who I'm talking about. It's Leonard Kahn. One of his last album, one of his last songs, is this incredible piece called "You Want It Darker." Okay, and it begins. It's a long poem, and I'm not going to read it all to you. I'll save that luxury to my own poetry shortly. But it opens with, "If you're the dealer, then I'm out of the game. If you are the healer, it means I'm broken and lame. If thine is the glory, then mine must be the shame. You want it darker, you kill the flame. Magnified, sanctified be thy holy name, vilified and crucified in the human frame, a million candles burning for the help that never came. You want it darker, Hineni, Hineni. I'm ready, my Lord." So here, this complex man is talking with complex layered metaphors. Of course, there's a strong Christian element to it, but it's not the Christianity of salvation, it's the Christianity of Christ on the cross. Beyond that, as a coming out of, Cohen, coming out of a Jewish tradition, he refers to the Jewish words Hineni, which means I'm ready, okay? One of the phrases ostensibly spoken by Christ on the cross. If you're the dealer, to go back to that metaphor, he's dealing the cards. What set of cards have each one of us got? How do we respond and play our hand? We're born, we've given a hand of cards. How do we play it? How do we play it to win? Or how do we play it in order not to lose? But there's always this struggle between, in Cohn's mind, between an open and light way and a closed and dark way. And he's, I guess, saying in his conversation, a monologue, you could say, with God, with the divine, however you want to frame that, this is the human lot. And knowing that he was towards the end of his life, he knew that soon he would be out of the game. But if you want it darker, you've got to kill the flame. So this killing of the flame, what can it mean? I'm not going to sort of give you my take on that so much as to suggest that this is a question that we need to answer, and we need to look at poems like this because they take us on thought journeys. And the beautiful thing is that they are porous, they leak. There's not any absolute definite interpretation here. Poetry, if you were in a university like mine, you might go to a class and you might study this poem and you'll come up with with a best guess, and they might be very, very similar. But some of the readings depend on your cultural backgrounds, your own traditions, your ability to connect references with other cultural assets that we all carry. And that's one of the things about poetry. And I think it's one of the things that hinges on our exposure to the deep cultures that we inhabit. In fast time, culture becomes thinner. It becomes more reactive. It becomes a textbook and we follow the rules. But to slow down means to give us time to reflect on our culture. And if we reflect on our culture, we can see it warts and all. We know what's good about our culture and what's bad, and that good and bad may vary to some extent. But in poems like this, we're invited to feel and reflect, and that's what really counts. So you could say that's a little bit of a prelude to me talking about this book in my hand here. This book covers 40 years of poetry, really. It's got an early poem I wrote in 1979. And I wrote a number of the poems in the 80s and the 90s, and then, of course, into the 21st century. And I just want to touch on a few because they're quite diverse, but I want to touch on them in a way that perhaps suggests or picks up on some of what I've just been talking about. It suggests that we can be so much more than we are, and that, our life is actually a journey towards exploring more of ourselves rather than less. The inward path is what poetry invites us to do. But I'm a person who meditates, and I meditate regularly every day. And to me, there is a meditative quality to poetry, which I pick up on in this little poem, The Inward Path. It's only 2 stanzas. In the time when the shadows lengthen before the dulcet dark descends, the birds swirl through the yellowing light. Then a moment comes when sense suspends and quiet thought touches the soul, eating the day's dust from the heart. This is when I sit, taking the inward path, following the shadows lightly, like a bird chasing the last light, the evening star always before me, constant like a trusted friend, calling, coaxing my laggard heart to pick up speed, make haste. So that's speaking in my mind to that moment where you puncture the busyness of the day and you take that inward path. I choose to sit. At other times, because I'm a greedy person, I might choose to read a poem instead. A poem that invites me into another space. Once there was a time when my romanticism was, at its peak, I guess. It's not that I'm not romantic now, but there have been certain moments when I've experienced certain elements of relation that have transported me out of time. And I think that out of timeness is something that poetry really speaks to and can surface in our own lives. So there's a little poem here called It Is You. And you will feel the romanticism there, but you'll also feel a sense of timelessness, that our relationships are not really bound by the here and now, but are actually elements of greater things that we often lose sight of because of our busy lives. It is you. When golden leaves fall, I shall remember you in the radiance of youth, all clothed in the joys that make a young heart old. As the leaves scurry past and mount in drifts, I shall recall broad, sparkling eyes and smile, all a-dazzle upon cheeks dappled in forest light. When the cold winds come to churn the forest gold, it is you who shall return to warm my heart and tread away the years which lie like leaves in the gutter, and we'll laugh and cry at youth's decline and age's reckoning. Yeah. So that timelessness is something that I think we need more of. They say that a person who has broached time, broken from time, has 1 foot in the here and now and 1 foot in some other time, some other place. And it's the way we can adjust our consciousness, a little bit like the way that when I was setting up this studio, the camera over there was a bit out of focus, and I had to work with the camera to get it to focus on me, to actually bring into clear definition, and now I'm looking at the monitor here, clear definition, the image of me. That kind of refocusing is what I think poetry is all about. And if it can save the world in some way, it saves the world one heart and mind at a time. It speaks to each individual as an individual. There's an eternity of universal constants. There's an individual that inhabits each one of those moments and spaces. And I'd like to finish with one last poem, which called The Next Big Thing, which is the name that I gave to the book. So, The Next Big Thing. To be human is to both love and fear, to rush in with open hearts where fools fear to tread, to flee in terror at the shadows that haunt our dreams. To be human is to bear this contradiction, as the pilgrims wore the shell badge on the road to Compostela. Yet my humanity is tight on me. I feel our skins cracking with the need to love more, fear less. I am called to trust in greater things, cast off the weight of the past, and seize new opportunities to love and work in love for richer futures, where a new humanity can breathe clean air. When I love, I'm expanded. Fear cuts me off, diminishes me, and then I fail to see the pattern, fail to connect the dots and taste my connection to all that is. To move beyond fear is the next big thing. To take up love as the challenge that enables. To realise the power of collective movement, where the most mundane of experience reveals itself in a myriad of ways to be a message to me and you that we can be so much more. So poetry can also act as a calling, as an anthem in the Bob Dylan, Joni Mitchell. It can act as anchors in our memories with the past, as in the case of If and the case of Hist. And it can also pave a way to a future where our ability to reflect on who we are and what we value and where we would like to be and where we'd like our children and grandchildren to be, and all those others beyond us, beyond our family allegiances, beyond humanity itself, to this planet. I think poetry has great potential. It's one of the tools in making a better world. As to whether it will save it or not, that's up to you to decide. Thank you very much.